Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy Wasserman, and I'm the Community Sales Manager here at Politics and Prose Bookstore. And I wanted to welcome you to PMP Live this evening. As you know, Politics and Prose is one of DC's premier independent bookstores and cultural hubs, so we're super happy you're here with us. Before we get to the main show, as it were, a few announcements. First and most important, thank you. And thank you for continuing to support us by logging into tonight for what I know will be a super conversation between Thrity and Ben. We hope you will also continue supporting us by purchasing tonight's book of discussion, Honor, from PMP. We'll be putting the ordering link in the chat box throughout this evening's talk, so you can order it online, and we can either send it to you or hold it in the store for you to pick up. And while you're on the website, take a moment to wander around and to learn some of our other sort of extra programs. You know us for our books, but we do things like the Book a Month service, where we can curate books based on your interest to arrive at your doorstep every month, or the Community Sales Program, which I run, where we design and produce author talks for private organizations and businesses and institutions. And as we like to say at PMP, so many books, so little time. So back to tonight. For tonight, your mic is on mute, but we encourage you and want you to participate in the discussion by asking our guests questions via the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to everyone's questions. And if we don't get to yours, I apologize in advance. We're also providing closed caption on demand, so you can click on the CC link right next to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you want to access that service. So it's now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. First is the very prolific Thrity Umrigar, who will be discussing her new novel, Honor. Honor has been described as, quote, a powerful, compelling story set in modern India, a heart-wrenching novel with hope and romance, redemption, and plenty of plot twists, quote. It was also, most excitingly, just named this month's pick for Reese's Book Club. And Thrity will be in conversation with attorney turned novelist, essayist, and reporter, and apparently good personal friend, Ben Fountain. Like Thrity, much of Ben's writing focuses on what happens when global cultures meet at the personal level. And so with that, the floor is yours, you guys, and take it away.
All right, Thrity, it is great to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me to participate. Congratulations. By my count, this is novel number 9.
It's true.
And you have published a memoir and 3 picture books. So, I mean, by any measure, this is a strong, substantial, and really fine body of work that you're in the process of producing. So I just want to say hats off and bravo to you. You are a hardworking writer, and you're an example to all of us non-prolific writers. This is your first book with Algonquin, correct?
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Okay, Algonquin Books of Chapel Hill. I just want to say, I think they did a beautiful job with the production. Let me just hold it up. And you see this sumptuous cover art. And I tried to find in my wardrobe the thing that would come closest to matching the cover, but this is the reddest thing I have. I guess I need to spice up my wardrobe some, but
I guess I'm mailing you a shirt next week.
Oh, you have shirts?
Yeah.
You have shirts? Okay.
Yeah.
I want a shirt. But anyway, I think Algonquin did a beautiful job with the production of it. And I mean, the words inside, the story inside is as powerful as any I've read in the last 10 years. I'm going to ask you, Thrity, to begin by describing the book, just generally, the time and place, the thrust of the narrative, and the people involved, just to set the stage for further discussion.
Absolutely. But before I do so, Ben, heartfelt thanks to you for agreeing on relatively short notice to moderate today's discussion. I hope I don't embarrass you by saying that not only are you one of my favorite writers on earth, but you're also one of my favorite human beings. So to start off this virtual book tour with somebody like you it just doubles my joy and pleasure. So thank you. Honor basically tells the story of two women from very different backgrounds, very different walks of life. First is Mina, who is a very simple, woman, a rural country girl, basically, the daughter and sister of peasants, functionally illiterate, from a very humble background, and she is somebody who has basically, she's product of a patriarchal culture. She's very submissive, has listened to her father, and after his death, the oldest brother. And all is going well until she commits two acts of defiance. The first is something as simple as taking a job outside the home at a factory that has sprung up in a neighboring village. And this is seen as a great, grave dishonor, not just to the brothers, who are barely eking out a living themselves off the land, but also to the culture of the village itself. We are told that she's a pioneer along with her younger sister in that no other woman from this village has dared do such a radical thing. And as if that's not bad enough, she also makes the mistake of falling in love, choosing her own husband, and that husband happens to be Muslim. Mina is a Hindu woman. And for this grave transgression, she pays an extremely heavy price. Smita is an American journalist. She's Indian by heritage and background, but she hasn't lived in India for almost 20 years. She's a New Yorker. She lives in Brooklyn, educated, works at a prestigious newspaper, and she's a global correspondent focusing on women's issues. And when a colleague who's based in India needs her help, she sort of parachutes in to take over the story of covering Mina is suing her brothers for the harm that they've inflicted on her and her family. The newspaper that both Smita and her colleague work for are covering, they're waiting for the verdict of this trial. And Smita, that's how she encounters Mina. And then the rest of the story is simply Mina talking to us directly in her own words, telling us her story of how she met her husband, Abdul, the romance that blossomed between the two of them. And then there is a kind of parallel love story, if you will, that involves Smita, but her love story is a little bit more complicated because it's also a love story of rediscovering and perhaps falling in love with a homeland that you have left, and left with some rather unpleasant memories and hoped never to revisit, but then having to sort of assess as an adult the complexity of that relationship. So in a nutshell, that's really what the book is about.
You make a very interesting and crucial choice at the very beginning of the book. And that is, right, Shannon, who is Smita's friend and colleague, this is Shannon's beat. She's an American, she's a journalist, she is based in Mumbai, and she's been covering Mina's story from the very beginning. And in fact, you start the book with, it's a story that Shannon has written. And so to get Shannon out of the way, you have her, she's broken her hip. And so in desperation, she calls Smita and said, would you come and basically pinch hit for me on this story? And so I'm wondering, that's a critical choice. It affects the whole thrust of the novel. Why not just tell it from Shannon's point of view instead of simplify things and just Shannon doesn't break her hip. This is an American in India. She's trying to navigate her way through all of this. It's, it's a crucial choice, a strategic choice, and I know you have the best of reasons for it. I'd like to hear them.
Yeah, it becomes an entirely different novel if it's an American reporter simply covering a trial. Then it becomes a novel about a trial for the most part, and it becomes squarely, I think, Mina's story. I mean, I'm sure there are ways of sort of telling Shannon's story and backstory also, but that really wasn't the story I set out to tell. The story I set out to tell was a story of a kind of reckoning that Smita has to do. Smita, when we first meet her, is a rather closed, perhaps even slightly cold character. She's an insular character. Her own mother, when she visits her very spare apartment in Brooklyn, kind of feels a kind of pity for her daughter, for the choices, even the aesthetic choices that she makes in terms of the furnishings of the apartment, just how bare and cold it is. And I want some of India's warmth and exuberance and perhaps even a kind of irrational passion, which in Mina's case takes a kind of dangerous turn. But like all passion, there's two sides to it, right? Like all emotions, actually. And I want all of that to act on Smita. I want there to be a kind of change, a shift in perspective, in an understanding, and most importantly, and I think this is what you're driving at with your question, Ben, is that Smita has her own demons that involve her childhood in India, that the book and Mina, meeting Mina in particular, forces her to reckon with, and that to me is almost as important to the structure, to the scaffolding of this book as Mina's own story is, because there's a parallel there too, 20 years apart, but it's the same kind of forces at play on both women. And I couldn't have done all that with a professional American journalist who was just there to cover a story.
No, you're exactly right. And the effect is we get two novels for the price of one.
Yeah.
I mean, I found both storylines. I mean, often when you're reading a book with two or three different storylines, you find yourself favoring one over the other. And while you're reading one, you say, well, I can't wait to get back to, X. But here they were of equal weight. They were equally compelling to me. And they were playing off one another in a way that really resonated and just made each one deeper and more vivid. So, so you have a background as a journalist. You were a working journalist for a number of years, and I think it goes without saying that your background fed into creating Smita. Just her mindset, how she goes about her work. I mean, that's pretty obvious, I would think. But what I want to know is, did writing the book bring back particular things that you had forgotten or that had receded? I mean, I found in my own writing, the deeper I get into something, and I'm naturally drawing on my own experience, things will surface that I didn't know I knew, or I'd forgotten, or they'll surface, with a different kind of emphasis or from it in a different light. So did that happen to you in writing this book?
Yeah, I think so, Ben. And the most vivid example of that was a memory from almost 20 years ago. While I was in my last years as a working journalist, and I was lucky enough to win something called the Neiman Fellowship, which basically, I mean, it's the sweetest deal on earth. It basically gives mid-career journalists, which I think is just a polite way of saying middle-aged journalists, a year of free study at Harvard, and you just get to choose and sit in on whatever classes you wish. And the way it was structured back then, and I think even now, is that every year they would pick 12 American journalists, I was one of them, and 12 international journalists. And so it's a group of 24, which sounds like a very large group, but we were exceptionally lucky, the year that I was there, in that we were a very, very close-knit group. And, it's a group of writers and journalists together. So obviously there was a lot of drinking, and there was a lot of going, to restaurants and, all that extra stuff. So we got to know each other very well, and we would have a lot of conversations and debates about how journalism was practiced in different countries. And without exception, all the American journalists swore by what we would, what the message that was hammered into our heads, which was objectivity in journalism, right? And even if that objectivity took absurd lengths where we would give equal play to both sides of an argument, even if one was, provably false, right? That objectivity in your coverage. And almost to a person, the international journalists would say, wait a minute, how does this work? We come from countries where, were recently dictatorships, we pride ourselves on speaking truth to power. Advocacy journalism is the only right way to cover a story. If you give equal play to both sides, what do you stand for, right? And this was the one thing that really separated our groups. And I was, of course, in this weird position because, as far as I know, I have to think harder on this, but I think out of the 12 American fellows, I was the only one who was born and raised in a different country. Now, granted, I never practiced journalism in India. I was too young. I came here when I was 21 and, went to grad school for journalism in the States. So my whole training was here, and certainly my work experience was in America. And I swore by that, never really questioned it either. But I always saw my role in that group as a kind of ambassador or kind of link between these two sides, And I never quite resolved this debate to my satisfaction, right? And I think I definitely drew on that, not confusion, but just that tug. I think Smita, I gave her that tug, that I could never fix or resolve for myself, as to what does one do? Mohan, who's the other character, the male character in the book, who basically is her escort into this little village. He translates for her, he drives her there, all of that. Mohan, who has no background in journalism, to him, it's a no-brainer. If you see somebody who's starving, you buy them the biggest sack of rice and you deliver it to their door. And he doesn't understand how Smita, who could so easily help one of her sources, refuses to do so, right? So it's all that nuance and all that cultural conflict, professional rules being different depending on the situation. I tried to draw on that experience during my Neiman year and put that into the book.
Let's talk about Mina. Okay, Mina is, as you described, she is a peasant woman, born and raised in the country, functionally illiterate, no education to speak of, has come of age in an extremely patriarchal society, patriarchal and provincial.
Right.
And you do a tremendous job of evoking, portraying the depth of her humanity, the complexity of her thought and feeling. And you do it in language that absolutely rings true to me. I mean, I wouldn't call it spare, but I wouldn't call it, it's certainly not fancy, quote, literary language, but you find a voice for her and you find a vocabulary for her that I found to be absolutely authentic and genuine. And I mean, she is a person complete. I mean, she has a depth of heart, depth of thought, of soul. She's as vivid as any character I've come across in the last 10 years. And so my question, which is thuddingly inarticulate and plain, and yet no less sincere, is how did you do it?
I don't know, Ben, how did you come up with Billy Lynn?
No, but I'm putting you on the spot.
You're putting me on the spot. All right. I'll pay you back some other time. I think by trial and error, you write, you channel the voice in which a character comes to you. You put all that down on paper, and then begins the, that's the fun part of just channeling a voice that you hear in your head. But then you have to refine it because something about this person, their class background, sort of their life circumstances, how the lack of opportunities they might have had. And so then you start paring down the way they speak. I wanted to do two perhaps seemingly contradictory things with Mina's voice. One was, I most certainly wanted her to have a kind of bare bones, here I am telling you the story of how we met, how we fell in love, and what happened to me. I wanted that. But within the rules that I set for myself, the severe rules the restrictions that I set for myself, I wanted there to be a kind of musical quality to the way she speaks. She is not a coarse woman. She's a sensitive soul. She is, I dare say, a poetic soul, and I wanted that fragile nature of who Mina is, I think, to be reflected in her voice, because we don't have a whole lot else to go by. Half of her face is disfigured, right? So it's not like I could go into a lot of physical description that would convey how beautiful and how bird-like and fragile she is, So she has to do the heavy lifting for the novel. She has to tell us in her own words. So I wanted that kind of innocence, that kind of purity, if you will, that's reflected not just in her speaking to us directly, but also what she tells us about her husband. They are a bunch of kids and they are idealistic. They really, really think that they can defy all these conventions just because they love one another, and that there'll be no consequences to that, right? So I think just by trial and error, it has to sound right. I mean, this. I mean, language is all about music, right? It has, you can hear those false notes just like you would, if you were playing music, and you just watch out for the false notes and you remove them when you hear them. So.
Well, those passages in particular have an inevitability about them. I mean, the language is so true, the voice is so true. You're reading it, this reader is reading it and thinking this is the way it is, this is the way it has to be. So bravo, hats off to you. All right, honor. There is a fair amount of violence in this book, necessarily so. I mean, at the heart of it lies two acts of extreme violence, one fatal, one near fatal. And then, as it turns out, 2/3 of the way through the book, we learn the secret of Smita's past. And extreme violence lies at the heart of her life. That was the pivot point of her life. I want to know how you work yourself up to writing scenes like this. Because, I mean, okay, first of all, I want to say they're extremely effective and vivid. They're wrenching. At times, they're difficult to read. That's how good they are. You are digging down into the stuff of powerful human experience and really dark human experience. And I just want to know, like, what is your interior self? What are you going through to work yourself up to confront experiences like this? And not just confront, but immerse yourself to the point that you can write them accurately.
You know, I think I'm just following the story. I think I'm following the characters to where they lead me. And when I say that, what I mean is I'm clearly following their interior life, you know, their thoughts, their feelings, rage, fear, the entire gamut of human experience, following that, trying to replicate that on the page as best I can. And then I'm trying to follow their actions. And when it comes to the actions, which are the violent part, I'm almost breaking it down to technicalities. I have never kicked a human being in my life. I don't intend to, ever. I don't know what the force of that feels like against the human body. I don't know, you know, I'm not willing to find out. But I have to be able to imagine that both as the receiver and the doer, right? Both. I somehow within me in that moment, in that 3 words or 1 line, whatever it ends up being, I have to be able to absorb the blow of that, and I have to be able to inflict that blow. I don't know how writers channel all that. I don't know. All I know is I was about to say, I try and set myself aside and put the primacy on the characters. But I think that's not entirely true, because I'm just describing to you that I'm occupying both those roles, right? And yet it's not about me. I mean, it basically comes down to that. It's not about me. The writer has to get out of the way of the story. You know, that's the only way. It's like if a book is a play and it's being staged on a stage, on a physical stage, you know, the audience doesn't want to see the director up on that stage saying, you know, scratch your nose, raise your hand. No, the director is done. The director is off stage, and you're only seeing the actors on the stage. And that's how I think about what I'm trying to do, you know. And writing scenes of violence is hard for me because I don't have much life experience with that. You know, love and sadness and loneliness and joy, these are the gamut of human experience that I can draw from the past, from my own sort of spring, if you will, and replicate on the page. But there are certain things that are simply alien to me, and that's where it becomes truly an act, not of memory, but of imagination, right? And I think for a novel to work, one really does need both. I don't know if that made any kind of sense, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, these aren't easy questions to ask, to answer, excuse me. They're easy to ask, hard to answer. Do you feel a psychological cost, a burden? Like, you know, when you get up in the morning and you say, oh, this is what I'm faced with getting on the page. And while you're writing it, after you've written it, do you feel drained? Do you have nightmares at night, when you're writing things like this?
I don't have nightmares at night, but I feel completely drained and wasted after a scene like that. Because a scene like that is not just technically difficult to write, it's emotionally difficult to write. And I do have to, there are times when the writing is easy. And one of the pivotal scenes towards the end of the book, I agonized over that scene because, again, you don't want it to be cheap. You're not, my intention, I felt like there was no real option other than to stay in that scene for as long as I do. There was no way to skip over it. I think it was important to show what human beings do to one another, but there was a buildup to that. I try not to spend a lot of time asking myself, is there a cost? Is there a personal cost to this? Because again, I try very hard to keep the focus where I think it should be, which is on the book and on the characters. But there is no way one can either read or write about some of this stuff without feeling a psychic burden from it. I mean, that I think that's what we sign up for, And I think the only way we can do justice to the issues that we write about and the characters that we create is to not flinch, is to not flinch at the last moment because it's too painful, or heaven forbid that it might be upsetting to a reader. I understand that it could be. It's upsetting to me as a reader and a writer, both. But those are the kinds of topics I've chosen to engage with. So I think I would be doing a disservice in some weird way, not just to the characters, but also to my readers by sugarcoating things that I think happen in the real world.
Right. Right. I'm going to, I want people to know that Thrity can really write. And this book is full of killer lines, big time lines. And so I want to read a few of these. I mean, it just gives me a lot of pleasure to read writing like this out loud. And I want people in the audience to know that this author can really write. And then there's a third reason, which I'll get to at the end of this. It involves a question, but here are some examples of killer lines. Right, Mina, she's thinking about her future husband, Abdul. She thinks, my heart was singing like a transistor radio. I mean, it's very sweet, and that just hit me. And then here's Mina thinking about her future husband's words regarding, the conflict between Hindu and Muslim. She said, his words cut open a belief I had held my whole life. But when I looked inside, there was nothing there. And then she's thinking about him at night. And she expresses it this way. Once again, I tried to solve the puzzle. What exactly made him a Muslim? I imagined myself examining a long row of hands. How would I know which ones were Muslim? And then here she is reflecting on the memory of her husband and trying to recall his face. He is beginning to fade from me, like the moon rising higher in the sky. Here she is thinking about her sister Radha and the kindness her sister showed her. I folded my hands as if I was in the temple and she was a deity. And then here is Smita speaking to Mohan at a critical moment. Mohan, she said, the single word, a cup, holding her terror, her loneliness, her guilt, her confusion. The single word, a cup. She cracked the window slightly, and India rode in on the night air and entered the car, a third passenger. In a way, that sums up Smita's whole experience there. India's been riding with her the whole time. And then here's Mina, my daughter, whose face I kept under my eyelids as the kicks and rods destroyed my remaining body. Not just I held in my mind or I thought of, whose face I kept under my eyelids. That's what drives it home. Thrity, this is my question. What is the internal experience or sensation of striving for the right line, the killer line? That combination of words that's not just pretty or fancy or literary, but really crystallizes something profound about human life. And I would say that's present in all those passages I've just read. So, I mean, what is the physical and psychological experience of you sitting there at the computer or with a pen in your hand and the paper there, and you're like, what is this experience? How can I get it on the page? Tell me what you're going through.
Yeah, I'm trying to, it's a great question. I don't know if I have an equally great answer for it. Trying to connect it and remembering some of the lines that you just read. I know it's a very, very intense feeling. I know one has to go extremely deep within you. I know one has to avoid cliches because they rise to the surface immediately, right? You, instead of saying a transistor radio, you know, I forget the beginning of that. Was it the heart?
Yes, my heart was singing like a transistor
Singing,
radio.
yeah. So, you know, the first thing you want to say is heart was singing like a bird on a, you know, on a branch outside my window, right? And
shoot that bird.
Yeah, exactly. So you avoid that because that's the easy one and that's the cliched one. And then you think, well, what else sings? And more to the point, what else sings in a way that she would understand it? You know, I'm not going to say sings like an opera singer playing at Carnegie Hall, you know, because that's not Mina. That's not her world. But what does Mina possess when she's that poor? Doesn't have an iPhone, right? She's not on a playlist. What would she have? Maybe, just maybe, she has a transistor radio from the 1980s or something, right? So you know, some of it just flows and it's organic and it comes to you, and thank God for those small mercies. And some of it is groping around, casting around for just the right language, the right analogy, the right metaphor, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute about Rupaul Bozel, the village headman. I mean, Rupaul he's probably the villain of the story. He sets in motion a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of destruction. He's the village headman. He is the guy who decides. And not only is he the secular authority in the village, he's also a shaman. He's a magic man. And I would go so far as to say this is presented straight in the book. I mean, without evident skepticism. And let me go into that a little bit. I mean, Mina is thinking about Rupaul at one point, and she thinks he's renowned for having once pulled a live snake out of a woman's mouth and turned it into a bird. But she doesn't say she saw it herself, but this she did see herself. She has seen him walk on hot coals and not burn his feet. And then he saw her, a friend of hers was suffering from jaundice, and he rubbed a stone over her body and then told her mother, wash her. And so her mother washed her, and the cloth she washed her with, when she wrung it out, the water was yellow, as if the jaundice had come out. And so even Smita, you know, she has these encounters with Rupaul, and physically they're you know, unnerving at the very least. And but I mean, Smita, she's modern, cosmopolitan, educated, but she's afraid of his magic powers. And at one point, Mohan is challenging him and making fun of, oh, you're a magic man, and Smith is saying, he doesn't really mean it, RuPaul. I mean, it's just ignore what he's saying. And so what are we, modern readers, supposed to make of all this? Is there a different reality out there in the countryside, or are there parallel realities, or are there layered realities?
I'll tell you about one sort of, the way I intended when Smita stops Mohan from challenging him and indeed mocking him. She's not doing it because she's afraid of him. She sees through his charade immediately. She just wants the story. And she, it's like you cultivate your sources, right? When you're a journalist, you don't want to blow off or have a source blow you off because they are offended because they think you're insulting them. So that is all, as the writer, I mean, that is all I intended in Smita's reaction to him. Mina, of course, because of her circumstances, because of her lack of education, she's not a skeptical person. She's an innocent, and there's a lot of superstition and power. I mean, Rupaul is a powerful guy in the village. He has money, he has land, he hires and fires these peasants to work in his home and on his farm. And he clearly spreads these tall tales about the jaundice thing. I was hoping that the modern reader would pick up on the phone that he's a fake, basically, right? He's using some stone that probably leaves some kind of a yellow residue on somebody's body. And then he's faking them out by saying, look, I just drained all the jaundice out of your body. We never do know how the woman, if she recovers, how she recovers from the jaundice, right? So I intend him to be, a sinister figure for sure, just because of how much power he does have and how he wields it. But also for us to poke fun at him. I don't at all think that he has any magical powers. I think the only magic he does perform is in getting people to believe that he has these powers. And that itself, I guess one could argue, is a kind of dark magic,
Right. Well, yes. And I mean, Mina herself, there's a way in which his magic is real when he declares that Mina and her sister are to be ostracized, shunned in their village.
Right.
She said, with a snap of his fingers, Rupaul turned us into ghosts. I mean, that's real magic, what you were talking about.
It's power.
Yeah.
Right? It's power. Yeah, I guess one could say power is a kind of dark art in some cases,
So we've got about a little less than 20 minutes left. And so I'm going to go to questions. And let's see, Joan wants to know, including contemporary issues and comments in honor fascinated me. What was the impetus beyond strong beliefs? Okay, let me read that again. Including contemporary issues and comments in honor fascinated me. What was the impetus beyond your strong beliefs? Parentheses, a prolific writer who focuses on social justice in action. That's the question.
In order to make a story credible, in order to make characters believable, you just do try and anchor them as much as you can in recognizable life around us, right? So I think bringing contemporary issues into the mix is just a way of creating a more believable and credible world. I mean, I'm a person who's pretty politically opinionated. I have my beliefs as a citizen and as a human being. But if they are not in service to the novel, I'm not going to bring those in. So I'm not writing books to, to promote a certain agenda. I want the world that I'm creating in my books to reflect what I think my characters would see reflected through their eyes.
Okay, and I'll combine Joan's follow-up question with a question from Ellen. Ellen wants to know, are any of the characters autobiographical? And Joan is asking, Thrity, who in your life influenced your notion of who Mina was, how she behaved, what she said? In your other books, there's often a character who could have had Mina's life if they'd been more rural than urban. So is Mina based on anyone in particular?
No, nobody I know personally, but I should say that the origins of honor, the novel, began after I read a series of articles in the New York Times written by Ellen Berry, who at that time I believe was the South Asian bureau chief, and she wrote a lot about women in rural India. And, I'm sitting in my home in the United States, reading these stories 4 or 5 years ago. And I was not only was I impressed with the fabulous journalism and the beautiful writing that went into these stories, but I was dismayed and shocked. I mean, a lot of the customs that Ellen Berry described, the strictures against women working, a lot of that came as news to me. So it's not so much that I borrowed from my life or that I knew anybody like Mina personally, but the novel definitely owes a debt to Ellen Berry's fabulous journalism in those articles. And also what she wrote about the corruption, this whole village council system that Rupaul is, in the novel, the corruption of the police, all of that, I drew upon from her articles.
Yeah, when we're about to get the verdict on the brothers, I mean, Mina has sued her brothers for what they've done to her. I mean, they killed her husband, they disfigured her, and Anjali is her lawyer, and so Mohan, Smita, and Anjali are at the courthouse with Mina, and Anjali, well, no, the word comes from Smita that the judge has been bribed. The brothers and Rupaul have bribed the judge to rule against Mina. And so Mohan, being Mohan, he says, well, I'm not a lawyer. Why don't we offer the judge a bigger bribe? If that's how it works. And Anjali says, no, we don't do that. We're trying to change the system. And if we bribe the judge, we're just perpetuating that system. And Smita says, okay, well, what is Mina? Is she the sacrificial lamb? I mean, aren't we after justice here? Mina deserves justice. There's no answer to that. It is an impossible ethical question.
Yeah, and in some ways it parallels what I was saying earlier about the conflict between the Neiman group, the International Fellows and the American Fellows. These are great questions to ask. And, in terms of justice for Mina, it just depends on where you think the spotlight of that justice should be. If it's on the individual, then definitely, bribe the judge and get justice for Mina. But if you want to create structural change, then bribing a judge just perpetuates the system, right? So it's that eternal question about the individual versus, society, and where should the focus be?
You don't shy away from the hard stuff. You bring it right at us, and you don't give us easy answers.
I would if I knew what those answers were,
I hear you.
But I don't know what they are. I believe there's some value, I hope. Maybe this is the foundational belief of all literature. I believe there's value in simply raising the questions.
Laurie says, Thrity, I've read all your books and loved them. Ooh. I've read all your books and loved them. Do you have any past characters who linger in your mind that you'd like to follow up with?
I'm not sure that I necessarily would want to follow up with her, but I have to say that Parvati, a character in my novel Just Before Honor, The Secrets Between Us, is probably my all-time favorite character that I've created, because she's a quarrelsome, just foul-mouthed, but extremely soft-hearted person who doesn't wear her heart on her sleeve. In fact, keeps it very, very firmly hidden from the world at large, but is this terribly vulnerable and soft-hearted person who life has just brutalized so much that she has to have this veneer, and I'm very fond of Parvati as a character.
Okay, Vicky says, Thrity, Mina is a fragile soul, as you said. This innocence you wished to portray, did this life send Mina into two halves? I grew up in Iran, went to the American school for years. It was a life of two conflicting cultures, but even so, we females, despite our patriarchal homes, managed to completely disconnect ourselves from one culture to the other as we entered each scene. Does Mina have this same skill, if you like?
Mina doesn't have the same skills because she doesn't have the same opportunities. Mina doesn't have a school to escape to. She doesn't have any world except this incredibly tiny world of the village that she's been born into, the home that she's been born into, the family that she's been born into. And when she tries to widen that world by falling in love with, having basically an interfaith marriage, going to work and earning money, her own money for the first time, the minute she tries doing all those things to better herself, to follow her heart, these structural obstacles come in the way. So, she just doesn't have those same chances that so many of us did.
Susan wants to know, is Honor your darkest novel?
It's interesting. When my agent first read the book, he said to me, wow, you've finally written a love story. And I thought, I did? But the more I think about what he said is, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of love stories. This is a book about people falling in love with people who are very different than them, not just in Smita's case, but in other characters' cases too. So it is a dark novel because it does have, as Ben said earlier, acts of violence in it, that kind of thing. But I think it's also a hopeful novel about possibility, about, following the dictates of your heart, all the while understanding that even something as trivial, seemingly, or as commonplace as falling in love, which all of us have done and all of us take for granted, is actually a privilege. Okay? People around the world don't get to exercise that what I consider to be one of the most fundamental acts of humanity, of being human, that one can do, which is choose your own heart. Even that, for millions of people, is a privilege.
Right, Grace says a lovely thing. She says, Honor, like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, is eternal and marvelous in its portrayal of the dark side of community. And then Grace goes on and asks the $1 million question, are you satisfied with your work?
Of course not. That's the $1 million answer. Of course not. There's a reason, Grace, why I've never, ever had the nerve to reread one of my books from start to finish. And I probably never will, because all you see, as if it's some neon light that's flashing at you, is awkward language, unbelievable plot twists, just all the things that, you want to forget about is what leaps out at you. And the kind of lines that Ben read, they're just wallpaper. They're just background noise.
All right, there's Ami is Mina's mother-in-law, and Ami, she is really unlikable. I mean, she's vicious and mean to Mina. She's bitter. She's sarcastic. She's cruel. But this lady has also had an extremely tough life.
Right.
I mean, she watched her son be burned to death, and she's left with no prospects for survival except eking out a living somehow. So, I mean, it's a very hard life. If she's bitter and mean, she's sort of earned it. But at one point, Ami is in Mohan's car, and they've rescued her and her granddaughter, and they're taking her away, and Mohan asked her, is there anybody in your village who would take you in? And Ami snorted, those cowards, no. In this age, who will stick their neck out to help an old woman? And at that moment, I liked her. It was like, she was like, nobody's going to stick their neck out for an old woman. And so I found myself liking her. And then a few lines later, there's another exchange. And then Smita admits to herself, wow, I really don't like this old lady. And so I felt whipsawed in the loveliest way. It's like, just when I start to like Ami, Smita's like, I really don't like this old lady. She's very unpleasant. So bravo. I don't know why it gave me pleasure, but it did.
Thank you.
Oh, Wendy, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, that was an epic.
There you
fail.
go.
Well, with that, we've come to the end of our hour, and what a great conversation about like love and language and justice and process and yeah, fabulous. So I hope you all have a chance to buy the book. If we haven't mentioned that before, please buy the book. But I wanted to get the last question in, which is kind of a non sequitur, which is, what are you guys both reading?
I'll go first. I've just started beginning pages of my friend Paula McLean's novel, which came out several months ago, called When the Stars Go Dark. Just started on that. Oh,
lovely. And you, Ben?
Right, I've got two books. One is a book I just read in Galleys. It's a debut collection, a debut book called Stories from the Tenants Downstairs. And it's by a new writer named Sadiq Fofana. I'm going to hold up the cover.
Beautiful.
And is it coming across backwards?
Yeah. No, it looks great.
But anyway, it's going to be published by Scribner this summer. And it is just a dynamite book. It's called Stories from the Tenants Downstairs. And this guy has a tremendous amount of talent, and he's got a lot to say. The second book is I'm one of the judges for a new prize called the Republic of Consciousness Prize, and a very fine bookseller here in Dallas named Lori Feathers of Interrobang Books. She has started this prize to support and acknowledge the work of small presses, and so we're calling for submissions right now. So, go to the website. If you Google Republic of Consciousness Prize, you'll see how to enter, and you'll see the guidelines. But anyway, we want to, under Laurie's leadership, we want to support small presses because they're doing great work, important work. and the contest is the competition is open to short story collections and novels. But I just read a great novel called, backwards again,
Pollock's Arm.
it's called Pollock's Arm by a German author named Hans von Trotha, and it's published by New Vessel Press in New York. It's a beautiful book. The production, it's a gorgeous book, and a really wonderful book. So I'm looking forward to getting into my stack of novels and short story collections for the Republic of Consciousness Prize.
It's a great, great name. I mean,
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I loved how you ended the conversation talking about the beauty of the physical book, because that's how you started the conversation, by flashing Thrity's cover on the screen as well, which is also a stunning cover. So,
well, I'm very shallow that way.
I would say you're very
you
tactile.
do judge a book by its cover.
As do I. So I'm going with tactile here. Anyway, thank you to both of you. I know we're now standing in the way between a lot of our viewers and dinner time. So I wanted to just thank you again and for your time. And again, to everyone who's been tuning in, thank you again for your support, for taking the time to listen to this fabulous conversation, for buying the book, for supporting Politics and Prose. You don't just have to buy one copy. You can buy many copies, and many copies of Ben's books. We have a bunch of those too. So, do take a minute to do that. And thanks again, and take care and stay well read. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you, Ben, both of you. Thank you very much for hosting. I really appreciate it. It was a great experience.
All right.
Super fun. Super
Thank
fun.
you all. Good night.
Thank you all. Take
Good
care.
night to everybody who attended. Thank you so
Good
much.
night.
Bye-bye.